Friends, in our gospel passage today from Luke 16:19 to 31, Jesus tells a story, a parable, a difficult story of a rich man who lived in luxury every day, while a poor beggar named Lazarus lay at his gate, covered in sores and longing for scraps of food. When both died, their fortunes are reversed. Lazarus is carried to Abraham's side, a place of comfort and solace, while the rich man finds himself in torment. And the rich man begs for relief, but Abraham explains that a great gulf separates them, and that in life the rich man had ignored Lazarus's suffering. What are we to make of this parable? And as we consider it today, I'd like to make a few, I guess, interesting observations as we explore its possible meaning for us. Firstly, isn't it interesting that in this parable, Lazarus, the poor beggar, is given a name, but the rich man is not? And there's something quite unusual about that in the world of ancient literature. In the ancient world, reading and writing were the preserve of the rich and the well-to-do. And so almost all literature tended to be written by the rich, for the rich, and about the rich. And because of this, in ancient literature, the rich were named. But in contrast, the poor masses were simply part of the expendable, unnamed masses, and their lives regarded as being of less value than those of the rich. Now, some would argue that things haven't changed much at all. In our world today, it is still largely true that the more money you have, generally speaking, the more value is put on your life. If the child of a rich person goes missing or dies, the story could easily make the headlines. But if the child were from a poor family, hardly anyone takes notice. Our world does not value all lives equally. But in this parable, this whole order of things is turned upside down. In this parable, the poor beggar is given a name. And by contrast, the rich man is left nameless. This is very unusual in the ancient world of literature. And it seems to me a deliberate storytelling device to communicate the sense that the values of this world are not the values of God. In God's scheme of things, lonely beggars on the street are named and valued. The way of Jesus turns upside down the ways and the values of this world. And this is a major theme in Luke's gospel. In the Song of Mary, when she praises God, she finds herself pregnant with Jesus. She speaks of how God will raise up the lowly and bring the mighty down from their thrones. In God's scheme of things, lonely beggars on the street, according to this story, are named and valued. Secondly, isn't it interesting that the dogs in this parable seem to care more for Lazarus than the rich man does? The rich man seems completely oblivious to the presence of Lazarus. It is like Lazarus does not even exist to him. And I wonder if you've ever had the experience when it felt like someone was looking right through you, as though you didn't even exist, like you were just a non-person. In highly patriarchal cultures, women often speak of this experience of being treated by men as though they were not real persons. And this is the sense you get from this parable. How difficult would it have been for the rich man to let Lazarus eat from the scraps under his table? What does this parable say about the state of the rich man's soul? That he could so easily and so thoroughly block out the need of a fellow human being, and even pretend that Lazarus does not exist at all. The rich man has cut himself off from an important part of what it means to be human. In psychological terms, when a person is unable to empathize with another human being in their suffering, such people are called sociopaths, and in more extreme forms would be called psychopaths. This is the inability to empathize with another in their suffering, and it's a sign in psychological terms of a malformed humanity, that something is missing in our humanity when we are able to do that. But by contrast, look at the dogs. In his deplorable state, the dogs come and lick his wounds. And when I first heard this parable, I would have interpreted this simply as pointing to the fact that dogs are disgusting, and a sign of just how deplorable this man's condition was. They come and lick his wounds. But as I allowed this image to sit with me in my mind for a while, the thought really struck me. Isn't this the way a mother dog would treat her own little pups, licking their wounds to clean them as an act of motherly care? And isn't this how dogs lick themselves when they are wounded? And so, isn't it interesting that even the dogs show more love and care to Lazarus than the rich man? An animal who we regard as kind of subhuman shows more care for Lazarus than his fellow human being does. And we might ask the question, has the rich man in the story begun to lose an essential part of his humanity? Thirdly, isn't it interesting in the parable that when the rich man dies and is on the other side, that he is still primarily motivated by self-concern? The only reason he calls out is because now he's suffering. But even in the state of his suffering, his attitude towards Lazarus has changed very little. At least now he acknowledges the presence of Lazarus. This is progress. But even in his state of suffering, he's still caught up in his old way of looking at things. Although he has finally acknowledged Lazarus's existence, and he even calls him now by name, he still wants to use Lazarus as a servant for his own ends. He wishes to treat Lazarus as a servant to run an errand for him, bringing a drink of water from across the great divide. Lazarus is not yet being treated by the rich man as a full human being of equal value and of equal dignity. And it raises the question, what if hell is not a physical place at all, but rather a metaphorical description of the state of the soul, or state of our consciousness? A soul that has turned in on itself, self-obsessed, self-absorbed, with a distorted view of the world and of others, and as a result cut off from others, and as a result also cut off from God, the source of all love and true joy. What if hell is a heart whose door is closed and locked from the inside? And what if release from this kind of hell of the soul can happen the moment we awaken out of our own self-absorbedness? And there are signs of hope in this parable. Sometimes suffering can have its benefits. It can be a catalyst for growth and self-understanding. And it would seem that in this parable, the rich man's suffering has had some positive impact upon him. At least now he sees Lazarus as a human being with a name. In his suffering, we also see a glimpse of hope, and that there is still a glimmer of love and care in his heart that we don't see at the beginning of the passage. He is now concerned about his brothers. He doesn't want to see them suffering. This is a glimmer of hope. Even Stalin, the great Russian Soviet dictator, even in him, the faintest glimmer of the image of God remained in him. Despite all his murderous human rights abuses, Stalin still showed a love for his mother. And there lies the hope for all humanity, that ultimately, I believe no matter how much it is covered up and covered over or forgotten, there is nothing that can ultimately destroy the image of God within us. It simply needs to be recovered. The great gulf or chasm in the parable between the rich man on the one side and Abraham and Lazarus on the other is one that neither Lazarus nor Abraham are able to cross. Why can't they cross it? Because the gulf or the chasm exists in the heart and the consciousness of the rich man himself. It can only be crossed when the rich man's consciousness itself is healed. It seems like an impossible situation. How will the rich man find relief from his suffering? But interesting, a little later in Luke's gospel, in the story of another rich man, the rich ruler who walks away from Jesus because he is unable to give his wealth away, Jesus reminds his disciples and us that what is impossible for human beings is not impossible for God. And though the door of the heart may be locked from the inside, at the end of John's Gospel, we hear of the ability of the risen Christ to appear behind locked doors, perhaps an image of the risen Christ's ability to appear behind the locked doors of our hearts and our souls, to come in and to liberate us from the hells of our own making. Evangelical preachers would hold this passage up as proof of eternal hell, but interestingly, there is nothing in this passage to suggest that the rich man's suffering will last forever. In Timothy 2, 4 to 6, we read that God desires everyone to be saved. And in Ephesians 1, verse 11, we read that God accomplishes all things according to his counsel and will. And so if God desires all people to be saved, then in God's good time, God will accomplish all things according to his will. In 1 Corinthians 15:28, Paul speaks of the day when God will be all and in all. And this is the final end of Paul's theology, that God will be all and in all. How can God one day be all and in all if some are left suffering for all eternity? God will only one day be all and in all if in the end, without exception, all are saved from the hells of their own making and brought into the wider embrace of God's love and mercy. And that would be a universalist interpretation of this passage. It is not a story about eternal hell, but it is a story about the hells of our own making, through our selfishness, that God comes to liberate us from. What might the story mean for us today? Perhaps it's just a reminder that compassion and considering the needs of those who are suffering in this world are not an optional extra for us as followers of Christ. Compassion is at the heart of what it means to be a Christ follower. And so those are just some, that's just some food for thought for today as we wrestle with another difficult passage in Luke's Gospel. Amen.